This month is Mental Health Awareness Month, and so we will be diving into the mental health of the characters of one of my favorite authors, Sarah J. Maas. Maas's characters are tough, but they've also gone through so much. So the question is, how do they do it? What's the secret behind their success? I believe that each of these characters handles their trauma in a unique way, and looking at them can help give us ideas on how to find happiness during difficult times. In this episode, we are stepping into Sarah J. Maas's enchanting Fae multiverse. We will take a deeper look into who I like to call the Big Three. These are the FMC, or the female main characters of each trilogy. This is a two-part episode. Today, we will be looking into the backgrounds and discussing how the backgrounds of these characters affect their characterization. And in part 2, we will discuss their mental health through the novels, as well as their relationship styles. Before we begin, a quick disclaimer. While I have immersed myself in the research of this topic, I am not a psychologist. I am an English teacher. So, your insights and feedback, especially if you're a mental health expert, is invaluable. Feel free to drop a comment or share a resource that deepens our understanding of these characters and their struggles. Let's embark on this exploration together. In today's episode, we're zooming in on the portrayal of female mental health in Sarah J. Maas's novels. While Maas excels in crafting fierce, multifaceted female characters who undergo significant growth and development, there's a glaring pattern in how she depicts male mental health. So let's address the brooding elephant in the room. Across Maas's books, male characters tend to handle their emotions in a singular way: brooding. Whether facing setbacks, adversity, or personal turmoil, they default to brooding. Their internal dialogues often echo themes of self-doubt and the perpetual pursuit of redemption. It's a cycle of brooding, grumpiness, and eventual resolution, often catalyzed by the intervention of a female character or occasionally their own efforts, but mostly the female characters. I think the most obvious example of this is Hunt Athalar. While some of Maas's male characters get a bit more depth, such as Rhysand, Hunt Athalar only exists to be Bryce's partner. At any point where we could see introspection or growth from Hunt, it is snatched away. The most recent example of this comes from Hofus. When Bryce returns from Prythian and talks to him on the boat, she railroads Hunt's feelings by saying, "You're either with me or against me." She later half apologizes for doing this, but I think that Hunt wanting to avoid conflict and keep those he loves safe is a fair emotion for him to have, considering everything he's been through. Then Hunt learns that he was created by Fae and a demon, and again, he isn't given the proper time to deal with these feelings. Maas gives him enough time to brood about being created, but then lets everyone else do his thinking for him. Both Bryce and Baxian tell him it's no big deal. It would have been nice to let him come to this conclusion on his own, or to have him just have the confidence enough to know instantly that he is a good person. I'm not going to lie to you. I was very disappointed with how Hunt was treated in this book. Other storyline and character growth could have been pushed back to the next book, which I believe will be called House of Many Waters, to give Hunt more opportunity to grow. Instead, he gets pushed to the back burner to exist only to serve as a pedestal for Bryce to sit on. The male character that we get the most growth from in all of the books is the most hated characters of all time, Chaol Westfall. Now, truthfully, I get that Chaol bothers a number of people. However, I think that he is one of the most realistic characters in Maas's books. Chaol is a man who has difficulty accepting change and holds himself and others to his set of moral standards. I can think of many people in the real world that are like Kale Westfall and have the same pitfalls as him. You could argue that Kale only went through this growth and change because of Irene, but I would disagree. Irene helped to bring out his better qualities and helped him to make the changes he needed. But I think he was on that path already, and he would have gotten there with or without her. While Maas unquestionably possesses the talent to create nuanced male characters, there's a noticeable lack of diversity in how they navigate their emotional landscapes. The men in this book are dominant, a bit broken, possessive, and exist only to move the female main character to the next point in their story. I am so excited to see if House of Many Waters, which I believed will be centered around Tharian and Ethan, will have a departure from this pattern. Will Maas present a spectrum of emotional responses from these characters, or will they be like the other male characters? Only time will tell. Let's move to the big three. We will be focusing on Feyre, Aelin, and Bryce. We will compare them and how they deal with trauma. Also, we will be looking at how Maas has evolved her characterization throughout these 3 book series. So let's start by talking about the big 3 and their backgrounds. As far as time period goes, Throne of Glass is the oldest of the 3. It takes place 50 to 100 years before ACOTAR, and we know this because Rhysand saves Aelin's soul, and that happened at least 50 to 100 years before Rhysand met Feyre. I couldn't find the exact dates, so please let me know what it is. So as far as background goes, the early life trauma that each of these characters faces happens because of time period. Let's start with Aelin, or Selena. Personally, I think that Aelin has the most traumatic background. Aelin was a princess in Terrasen when Dorian, king of Ardelane, started a war against the Fae. Thanks to Vlad magic repression, Ardelane is able to take out all of Terrasen in just a few days, leaving no survivors. However, Aelin's aunt is able to get her out of harm's way before the massacre ensues. Aelin travels in the freezing cold river for who knows how long before she's found by Arobin Hamel. Now it's clear that Aelin has repressed many of these memories because in book 3 she has a life-altering scene where she remembers all of them. And from then on, she becomes well known as Aelin. Selena doesn't have an easy life. Arobin is the king of assassins, and he is ruthless when it comes to raising and taking care of Selena. However, because of this, Selena is able to learn skills, and she becomes one of the most feared assassins in all the lands, at such a young age. During this time, Selena gains one friend who becomes her lover and then tragically dies because they were betrayed by Arobin. All of this is tragic backstory for Selena. However, I think the thing that really does her in is her time at Endovier. The labor camp that Selena endures is absolutely brutal. They whip her, eat her, and starve her. So not only is she physically beaten, Selena is also psychologically beaten. It is a miracle that Dorian gets her out of that camp when he did. Now let's move to Feyre. Feyre was also born into high circumstances and had that all taken away from her. Feyre's father, who I don't think has a name, if you know his name, let me know. All I could see him referred to was Mr. Archeron. If he has a first name and I missed it, please inform me. Back to the point. Mr. Archeron was a rich merchant who lost everything in a business venture. After losing all their money, Feyre's mother dies of typhus, leaving a broken man to take care of 3 daughters. Poor Mr. Archeron was besought with grief and is clearly depressed because he's not able to support these girls. He does a little bit of woodworking. But they basically rely on the charity of others and Feyre's hunting abilities. Feyre's sister Nesta is absolutely terrible to her. She lives her life as if they still had lots of money and treats Feyre as if she were dirt. Their sister Aelin is kind, but she also doesn't really have any skills to help their family stay alive. She plants a garden and makes everybody feel good, but not super helpful. So when Feyre is taken by a creature for killing the wolf, she is both relieved and devastated to be away from her family. Lastly, Bryce has the least amount of childhood trauma, but she is definitely not unscathed. Bryce's mother was a mistress of the king of the Autumn Court, who loved her very much. However, he was domineering and unkind to her. That made Bryce's mother, Ember, run away from him. The king of the Autumn Court then sent assassins after her mother, but thanks to the help of others, Bryce and her mother were able to escape. Bryce grew up half Fey and half human and never really felt at home in either space. When she was at school with other humans, everyone treated her funny. However, when she spent time at her father's house, she didn't really feel part of anything there. She does grow close to her brother Rune, but their connection is strained because of their father and a fight that they had. So Bryce grows up with a chip on her shoulder, and due to the racism she faced, she didn't have many connections. So when she gets a best friend, Danica, of course she gloms onto her. The two become like sisters, and they also have another friend, Juniper, who they spend time with. However, since this is an SJM story, Danica dies in a horrible accident involving synth, and Bryce is trying to find herself again after losing her best friend. So each of the three has trauma related to their circumstance. It seems like the type of trauma that each character endures has to do with the time period, Aelin being the oldest and Bryce being the most recent. Since Bryce's story is the most modern, her trauma has to do with racism and classism, and less with actual physical brutality. Aelin, coming from the oldest time period, had to deal with sexism, yes, but she also has to endure a massacre and a brutal labor camp, which may have happened in Feyre's time, but it didn't seem like it. People seem more civilized by that time period. Each of these women have to deal with the fallout of their parents and their lack of parenting. Though Bryce does have the grace of having an awesome mother and an excellent stepfather who makes sure she's safe and secure, therefore she is able to have the most secure attachments in the book. Now that we've covered backgrounds, let's move to characterization. How has their past trauma affected them in their situations, and how does it continue to impact them through these novels? In Throne of Glass, Aelin seems to have symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. The Mayo Clinic cites these as the symptoms of PTSD. Being easily startled or frightened. Always being on guard for danger. Self-destructive behavior such as drinking too much or driving too fast, or in Aelin's case, giving her life up for her friends. Trouble sleeping, trouble concentrating, irritability, angry outbursts or aggressive behavior, and lastly, overwhelming guilt or shame. I would argue that Aelin has many of these symptoms in Throne of Glass and the rest of the series. The first few nights at the castle, she doesn't feel comfortable and has difficulty sleeping, as well as difficulty feeling safe. But she's also a survivor, and she pushes through these feelings and finds a way to survive. First, she gets to eat all the sweets she wants, but she also has to train hard, which gives her purpose. Now, I know you all hate Chaol, but I think Aelin's relationship with Chaol is what saves her from regressing and giving in to her PTSD. Chaol helps give Aelin structure. They run together in the mornings and train together. He listens to her when she needs someone. Although they might not have been soulmates, I think that Chaol was the person that Aelin needed after being in prison. He understands some of the things that she's been through. In fact, she even says that with Chaol, she feels like she's home, which is something she hasn't felt in a long time. However, I do feel like her PTSD follows her throughout each of these novels, not only her time in Endovir, but the memories that she's repressed in childhood. Repressing childhood memories can also lead to many different outcomes for children. According to a study done by the Mental Health Center of America, repressing childhood trauma can cause children to have inflated sense of self and not to deal with cognitive dissonance. They also struggle with empathy because they control the narrative. Another study says that this is experienced through symptoms of insomnia, low self-esteem, anxiety towards certain people and or situations, and confusion. Research shows that the most effective way of reducing this burden is through recollecting the traumatic experience. So it appears that there is conflicting information about self-esteem, but some of the other characteristics match Aelin. She is not very empathetic, and although she can put other people before herself, she doesn't normally think about what others are thinking. It's unclear how much of these repressed memories affect her. At the age of 17, Selena tries to end her life at the salt mines. On the anniversary of her parents' passing, Aelin has had enough of this prison and she tries to free herself. Although she knows that the punishment for fleeing means you will be shot immediately. She unfortunately does not make it over the gate, but kills 4 overseers and 22 other people die in the process. While Selena is very calculated, she's also very rash. Most of the time, her depression does not get the best of her, but there are a few times in the novel when Selena wants to end it all and not necessarily give up, but sacrifice herself so she doesn't have to continue to struggle through her own existence. This battle that we see her fighting time and time again throughout the novel. This depression makes her more human and relatable as a character. All in all, though, Aelin is a survivor. These past dramas do not impact her day-to-day life. Again, it could be because she has to keep fighting the good fight. She does experience burnout or wishes that life would be different, but I do not know if it's different from anyone else. Feyre is very similar to Aelin. Both of them choose to fight as their survival method. I, for one, choose to freeze. But when their backs are against the wall, both Feyre and Aelin will claw their way tooth and nail to get out of a bad situation. That makes for an interesting female main character, and that's why I am not a main character. Feyre seems to have taken the trauma of losing their mother and their fortune in stride. She's not like Nesta, who feels the shame of loss. Feyre sees a job and she gets it done. However, she's under a tremendous amount of stress, trying to provide for her family with just a bow and arrow. She doesn't know if she will come back home or what will happen to her in that forest. Having to become a parent and take on adult roles makes Feyre resilient. However, it doesn't come without its drawbacks. A study by the University of Illinois states, the 2 main types of parentification are instrumental tasks, such as bringing in money to the household, and emotional tasks, such as becoming a confidant to a parent. Often, the 2 go hand in hand. She also added, families are experiencing some form of trauma may suffer from depleted resources as well as emotional distress. It also states that youth who are parentified are more likely to engage in unhealthy coping strategies, such as risky sexual behaviors and substance abuse. They may have difficulties in developing long-term relationships because they lack trust or feel overly responsible for the well-being of others. This is definitely something we see with Feyre. She has a difficult time making connections with people and is very stressed by her day-to-day life. So much so that when Tamlin takes care of everyone, she doesn't really know what to do with herself. We will talk more about Feyre and Tamlin in the next episode. Overall, Feyre's background causes her initial heartache, but she seems to use it as an asset more than let it hold her back. Because of her childhood, Feyre becomes strong and capable. She's able to handle moments of stress without letting them consume her. She is quick on her feet, and she gains skills that help her to keep herself and those she loves safe. Bryce, I think, is more unique than Feyre and Aelin. She is still tough and sassy and able to handle situations, but she's had to deal with more mental trauma than physical trauma. Although Bryce was cared for and grew up in a two-parent family, she still struggled finding her place at her human school. Bryce said she felt like an outcast because she wasn't full human like her peers. One study by Rubin states that children who are shy, withdrawn, or anxious are often victims of interpersonal rejection because their peers perceive them as temperamental differences, as social deficits that mark these children as non-threatening and unlikely to retaliate. Additionally, these children may struggle with social interactions, such as peer group processing, leading to rejection and exclusion. Research demonstrates that children who are socially withdrawn and who do experience peer rejection are likely to become more socially withdrawn over time. Thus, exclusionary behavior can reinforce shy and withdrawn personality traits that are already present. However, as we know, Bryce is one of the most confident and self-aware female main characters that Maas has written. So although bullying can result in childhood trauma, thanks to the coaching of her parents and her resilience, Bryce did not let these bullies get her down. She was also treated poorly by her biological father. Now, I read a number of conflicting stories about how this might affect children, but I do not think that any of them really apply to Bryce. How do you think that Bryce's relationship with her father impacted her as an adult? I think because Bryce had Randall Sulago, she had a father figure and two people who loved and took care of her. As far as relationships go, I think that Bryce is capable of the most stable connections because she had the most stable and least scarring childhood of the big three. That being said, we meet Bryce in book 1 of Crescent City after losing her best friend Danica. This makes Bryce lose her spark. In House of Earth and Blood, we see how Bryce bounces back from that loss and how she's still coping with it. This is something we'll talk more about next week. Background plays an important part of who we are as adults. In our early years, we develop many life skills that define how we react to certain situations and how we cope with situations that we're confronted with. There are many examples of this that we see throughout each of these novels. For example, Lysandra gives her ward a scar on her face so she's not forced into sex work. Elide is kind and empathetic because of her struggles. Moore is deeply tied and loyal to Rhysand because he saved her from an awful fate. It is clear that Maas considered the background of her characters and how that might affect their behavior in the book. The one last thing I wanted to talk about was the growth of the characterization throughout Maas's career. Aelin is a well-rounded character, but one would expect that from a series that has 8 books, 7 of which have Aelin as the main character. Some argue that the characters in Throne of Glass are more developed and better written than characters in other series. However, I tend to disagree with this statement. In ACOTAR, Maas is able to give so much depth to her characters in half the amount of time. I also love the themes and modern setting of Crescent City. I feel like these topics that she covers in Crescent City show more depth and thought and allow the audience to interact more with the characters and events. I would not say that one is more difficult to write than the other, but I think that her writing ability is only growing. I also feel that her characters are growing. That could be because the characters are older, but I choose to believe it's because she is growing as a writer. What do you think? Which of these SJM series is the best and why? One last reminder. I'm not a mental health expert, So there may be inaccuracies in this podcast. If there are errors in the podcast, they were not done maliciously. These were just hypotheses that I had after diving further into each of these characters. If you have any corrections to add or any insights that might help us to understand these characters better, make sure to share this information in the comments. I hope that you've enjoyed this episode of According to Your English Teacher. This week, we were able to look into the past of these women to see what kinds of people they were. Next week, we will be discussing what happens to them during the course of their novels and how their trauma impacts their reactions and situations. We will also be looking at how they handle the situations they are confronted with and how they grow and heal beyond their trauma. I'd like to leave you with one last quote from one of our favorites, Moore in Akawar. We are all broken in our own ways, in places no one might see. This episode was written by me, Sam Gunther, and edited by Dallin Gunther. The music was done by Tom Brinton. Please join us next week as we dive deeper into the worlds of the Fae multiverse. Hope you have a great day and happy reading.